This is Chapter 3 of Castoriadis and Critical Theory by Christos Memos. The chapter is titled Subversive Praxis, Open Crisis, and Critique. The revolts in Eastern Europe, and more specifically the Hungarian Uprising of 1956, offered a practical critique of the Soviet-type regimes and acted as a fire alarm for the forthcoming demise of Eastern European societies. The death of Stalin and the class struggles in Eastern Europe against the state bureaucracies evoked a debate vis-à-vis the crisis of Marxism opened up in 1898 by Masaryk, in which both orthodox and critical trends of Marxism participated. Dealing with the crisis of Marxism, Castoriadis moved from a critique of orthodox Marxism to articulate his critical approach to Marx's own thought. Castoriadis sought the reasons which caused this crisis, the factors which were responsible for the petrification and decay of Marxism. The degeneration of Marxism and the loss of its radical character were attributed to its transformation into a semi-religious dogma and a closed theoretical system. Castoriadis dealt with the questions regarding the crisis of Marxism long before Althusser's announcement of the crisis in 1977. Later on, and more specifically in 1978, Castoriadis contributed once again to the crisis of Marxism debate through his response to Althusser. This chapter focuses on Castoriadis' engagement with the crisis of Marxism by linking the two more remarkable open manifestations of the crisis. That is, the political-practical rupture of the Hungarian Uprising of 1956 with Althusser's academic theoretical announcement of the crisis 17 years later. It begins by bringing together Castoriadis' and Arendt's analysis of the Hungarian Uprising in 1956. Afterwards, Castoriadis' critical alternative approach to the crisis of Marxism is located within the Marxist theoretical discussions about the issue. Following an outline of Althusser's attempt to formulate the fundamental causes for what he saw as an overt eruption of the crisis of Marxism, the chapter goes on to present Castoriadis' critique and investigates the grounds on which it was put forward. Based on his argumentation, it will be considered why Eurocommunism and leftist social democracy failed to renew both Marxism and the anti-capitalist tradition and were led to become part of the systemic neoliberal crisis. The chapter concludes with an assessment of the implications of Castoriadis' arguments for the renewal of radical politics today. Section 1. Castoriadis, Arendt, and the Hungarian Uprising of 1956. The Hungarian Uprising constituted a turning point in the debates regarding the class character of Soviet-type societies. Its subversive and radical character triggered political and theoretical developments that had a catalytic effect on the future of these societies and the Western left. During the Cold War period and its theory of the two camps, the Hungarian tragedy posed difficult and poignant questions about socialism and its content. In the period we are dealing with, reason was, once again in human history, quote, a poor ally of reaction, end quote, which in all of its appearances in both Western and Eastern Europe denied, quote, reason its historical role of provoking insubordination and destroying horrors, end quote, and imposing conformism, formalism, and quietism. For the West, the Hungarian Uprising was a, quote, national and, quote, anti-communist uprising, end quote, that revealed the totalitarian nature of the regime and the despotic role of the USSR. For the latter and its satellite countries, or the orthodox Marxism and communist parties in the West, it was a, quote, counter-revolution, end quote, the work of fascist and conservative elements that sought the overthrow of socialism. Unsurprisingly, the Hungarian Uprising became a taboo for the vast majority of the communist movement, and in most cases it fell into total oblivion. Stalin was dead, but his shadow was still omnipresent. The function of critical thought was disdained, and leftist and Marxist scholars, denied their mission, lost their own foundations. They lost their reason and conscience. Within this political and intellectual milieu, it was Castoriadis in the Socialisme ou Barbarie group, along with Hannah Arendt, who saved the honor of critical and radical thought. The inconsistence of their reason and conscience was the basis that enabled Castoriadis and Arendt not to reconcile themselves with the so-called, quote, Marxist social reality, end quote, not to base their critical analysis on assumptions and presuppositions, and to take nothing for granted. The consequence of Castoriadis' dealing with the Hungarian uprising in this way was to bring to the surface the postulation for the unity of theory and practice. Castoriadis was always of the opinion that the crisis, the inconsistencies, and the contradictions in orthodox Marxist thought could not be overcome separately from the social reality of orthodox Marxism. Although Castoriadis had undergone a number of theoretical and conceptual turns as far as his evaluation of the Soviet-type societies is concerned, the Hungarian uprising was seen by him as confirmation of his elaborations since 1945. For Arendt, Stalin's death and the subsequent de-Stalinization period sparked off the succession crisis that destabilized the regimes, culminating in the total rebellions in Poland and Hungary. Arendt considered the failure of the Stalinist regimes to find a solution to the succession problem as one of the crucial factors in the explosion of the Hungarian uprising. In this respect, as she argued, quote, from the viewpoint of totalitarian imperialism, de-Stalinization was a major mistake, end quote. Arendt. For Castoriadis, on the other hand, the Hungarian uprising of 1956 had been, quote, the only total revolution against total bureaucratic capitalism, end quote. It was an open manifestation of a long-standing and at times invisible political and economic crisis. Economic inefficiency and disorganization, in combination with unbearable political repression, reached the 0 point. And this point became the point of social explosion and radical change. In Castoriadis' words, quote, the total bureaucratic capitalism of the East is full of contradictions and torn by permanent social conflict. Contradictions and conflict recurrently reach acute levels, and the system heads toward an open crisis, end quote. In fact, the above account may serve to reveal the perspective in terms of which Castoriadis views the social character of the societies in Eastern Europe. There has always been a tension at the heart of Castoriadis' approach, a contradiction which runs through his theorizing. On the one hand, his theoretical effort was dedicated to the construction of a Weberian ideal-type discourse, a new mode of domination, that is, the fitting of the Eastern societies to the category of, quote, total bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, as a new paradigm of rule. These societies are interpreted on the basis of successive new patterns of domination, which found the most extreme expression in Castoriadis' ideological concept of, quote, stratocracy, end quote. The use of abstract conceptual frameworks replaced the historically specific analysis of economic and political relations, and it was abstracted from particular historical and social tendencies or the complexity of class antagonism. On the other hand, in some cases, Castoriadis emphasizes the role of social conflict and contradictions that are immanent in these societies. By following the movement of contradictions, then, he manages to conceptualize them as the driving force of the Hungarian events of 1956. Thus, the distinctiveness of Castoriadis' analysis of the Hungarian uprising lies in his endeavor to focus on the social contradictions and the revolutionary practice of the Hungarian people. He placed much more emphasis upon social contradictions and the role of subjectivity, and this entailed the open crisis of Hungarian society being considered as a result of the strength of class struggle and of a range of cross-cutting historical and social developments. Castoriadis' emphasis on radical praxis, struggle, and activity directed attention to discontinuities of history and to a reading of the past as a living past which is not separate from the present. This way of thinking stressed the unpredictability and openness of history and enabled him to search for the meaning and the lessons taken from the Hungarian Uprising. As Feher and Heller phrased it, the Hungarian events amount to a, quote, symbol that will promote the process of, quote, learning from history, end quote, end quote. In this respect, Castoriadis endeavored to break the silence imposed by the European left upon the Hungarian events, a silence which in a similar way had overshadowed the Kronstadt rebellion and the unknown aspects of the radical tradition of the Russian Revolution. He sought the essence, significance, and implications of the Hungarian events, finding in them, quote, a new point of departure, a new source which forces us to reflect anew the problem of politics, that is, of the total institution of society, end quote. Castoriadis. In a similar way, Arendt argued that, quote, events past and present are the true, the only reliable teachers of political scientists, as they are the most trustworthy source of information for those engaged in politics, end quote. History is not evaluated according to abstract and arbitrary theoretical principles, and radical praxis is not developed from pure ideas. Rather, theory is produced from social and historical experience as it unfolded in and through the concrete historical activity of people. As Castoriadis put it, quote, both the project and the ideas have their origin in actual history, in the creative activity of people in modern society. The revolutionary project is not a logical inference from a correct theory, end quote. Theory is not separated from practice, and political ideas are not fixed in advance or outside class struggle. They claim no infallibility, but prove themselves in practical critical activity, quote, through the actual school of experience, end quote. While the role played by the communist in and through the revolutionary process was passed over in silence by Castoriadis, Arendt did acknowledge that the rebellion was initiated by the Hungarian communists and then was spread across the whole population. For Arendt, the revolution was made not by the, quote, underprivileged, end quote, but by the, quote, overprivileged, end quote, of Hungarian society. It started with the younger generation, the university students and intellectuals, whose motive was, quote, not material misery, but exclusively freedom and truth, end quote. As Karl Korsch stated, quote, socialism, both in its ends and in its means, is a struggle to realize freedom, end quote. The demands for freedom of thought, speech, press, and association challenged the established patterns of power, and the critical practical activity of the insurgents ruptured the dominant mode of social relations. Through their mass demonstrations, assemblies, councils, and general strikes, the social actors of the uprising underwent a, quote, process of self-education, end quote. And, quote, the whole country had been transformed into one collective moment of civil disobedience, end quote. The spirit of negativity and destructive critique was manifested against the traditional forms of political organization. There was neither vanguard party nor leaders who organized the revolution. There was no ideology that posited itself in advance as hegemonic and official truth. As Benjamin put it, quote, if it is the misfortune of the workers' rebellions of old that no theory of revolution directs their course, it is also this absence of theory that, from another perspective, makes possible their spontaneous energy and the enthusiasm with which they set about establishing a new society, end quote. The spontaneous and independent initiatives of the Hungarian people were not based upon complete theoretical systems and pre-decided models and structures of political action. The radical character and anti-authoritarian spirit of the rebellion had all the characteristics of a, quote, Luxemburgist revolution, end quote, which, quote, made itself and did not let anyone make it, end quote. Sorry, I'm not sure if that's Arendt or Castoriadis or who that quote is from. In this process of revolutionary self-making, the insurgents with their actions were led to a rethinking of the notion of labor and radically questioned the nature of time. They rejected the traditional and institutionalized form of, quote, production and work, end quote, and fought for the, quote, abolition of work norms, end quote, by demanding the democratization of work production and the establishment of direct self-management. By struggling against the orthodox Marxist and Leninist Stalinist perceptions regarding the educational role of factory and labor, they broke, quote, socialist Taylorism, end quote, as a form of economic organization. They did not only demand an end to the exploitative wage policy and the implementation of a new economic rationality. Most importantly, their radical political activity was, quote, a most humane outburst of hatred against alienated labor, end quote. Rupturing the dominant economic logic, they opened up a space towards the creation of a different image of social relations in which the notion of time is perceived as an entirely distinct dimension and value. The logic of, quote, socialist Taylorism, end quote, produced a conception of time very similar to, in fact, a copy of the capitalist notion of time. The latter was eloquently phrased in the words of Alexis de Tocqueville, quote, 12 years in America counts for as much as half a century in Europe, end quote. Both, quote, socialists, end quote, and U.S. Taylorism were united in a common conception of time, which is the time of capitalist technology, industry, deification of abstract labor and quantity. It is a notion of time driven by a trans-historical and metaphysical faith in progress and instrumental rationality that always prioritize functionality, velocity, and efficiency. By contrast, for both Castoriadis and Arendt, the insurgents in the Hungarian Uprising produced their own temporality of insubordination that defied the bourgeois linear conception of time. This was a time of unity, solidarity, fraternity, and struggle that interrupted, quote, automatic occurrences and conscious or unconscious repetitions, end quote, or forms of opportunistic and authoritarian policies. According to Arendt, quote, the 12 days of the revolution contained more history than the 12 years since the Red Army had, quote, liberated, end quote, the country from Nazi domination, end quote. In the same vein, Castoriadis vividly articulated the alternative conception of time put forward by the Hungarian explosion, quote, these events lasted only a few weeks. I hold that these weeks, like the few weeks of the Paris Commune, are, for us, no less important and no less meaningful than 3,000 years of Egyptian pharaonic history, end quote. Castoriadis. From the Paris Commune of 1871 to the workers' councils in the Russian Revolution of 1917, from the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to the Hungarian Uprising of 1956, the time of revolt and social emancipation confirmed in practice that there is, quote, a unity of the revolutionary project, end quote, a, quote, historical inheritance and continuity, end quote, of the revolutionary tradition of the exploited and oppressed. The radical activity of the Hungarian people broke up the, quote, repetitious cycles of social life, end quote, and led to a, quote, sudden opening of history, end quote. It was openness inherent in the move of the contradictions embedded in the character of the Hungarian Uprising. The open crisis constituted a turning point, a moment of historical discontinuity full of uncertainty and unpredictability that demystified the instability of the dominant social relations and revealed the radical alternatives available. This extension of collective disobedience unfolded the dialectics of order and chaos as expressed formerly in the works of Rosa Luxemburg. Quote, the apparent, quote, order must be changed to a chaos, and the apparently, quote, anarchistic chaos must be arranged into a new order, end quote. Luxemburg. The Hungarian Uprising implied the destructive critique of the division of society into a political and economic sphere, and in this sense it was a, quote, disorder, to be sure, but disorder of the right sort, end quote. Through its anti-authoritarianism, it, quote, produced enormous chaos, end quote. By seeking to overcome the divorce of labor and the means of production, and the logic of separation between the people and an alien external determination of their political and labor activity. Taken in this way, then, there was, quote, no chaos that resulted from the actions of people without leadership and without previously formulated program, end quote. The sunburst of the Hungarian uprising was unfolded in and through the, quote, universal politicization of society, end quote, in search of a genuine social change and the, quote, establishment of a new order, end quote. The politicization of social and labor relations involved a turning towards a different conception and reorganization of the economic and political sphere. This creative disorder opened up the possibility of creating radically new social relations by spontaneously generating new methods and forms of organization, namely the workers' councils. The open crisis, as the result of the intensification of social struggles, led to a rupture of the dominant pattern of class relations via the emergence of the council system. For Arendt, the formation and expansion of the councils initiated, quote, a new body politic, end quote, which disclosed the opposition between the parties and the councils, the representative democracy and the democracy of the councils. The Hungarian councils reincarnated the, quote, lost treasure of a long-standing revolutionary tradition and revealed once again one of the regime's main antitheses, quote, representation versus action and participation, end quote. The formation of the councils and the active participation of the people brought together critical thinking and radical political action through the inner and reciprocal mediation of theory and practice. Arendt viewed the councils as the product of the free and autonomous political activity of the Hungarian people, which constituted the only radical and democratic alternative to the party system. That is why councils and the council system have been permanently refracted from both the right-wing and the left-wing party bureaucracies, or have been intentionally disregarded by scholars, academics, and political analysts. Being the outcome of a genuine revolution experience, the councils turned into, quote, new political institutions, end quote, that substantiated and widened the meaning of political freedom. As Arendt put it, political freedom, quote, meant the right, quote, to be a participator in government, end quote, or it meant nothing, end quote. Arendt expounded her views pertaining to the role of the various forms of councils that emerged during the Hungarian uprising by making a distinction between the revolutionary councils and the workers' councils. The first had to play a critical political role, while the latter were responsible for the administration of economic life. In her interpretation of the function of the councils, Arendt separated the political and economic. She ascribed much more importance to the political functions of the councils, viewing them as a radical and spontaneous answer to political despotism and the authoritarianism of the regime. On the other hand, much less emphasis was placed on the workers' councils, which were considered as people's reaction to the bureaucratically controlled trade unions. She questioned the capacity of the workers' councils for economic self-management, and her views about a potential implementation of the council system to the reorganization of the economic sphere remained unclear. Thus, she did not understand the political and the economic as constituting two moments of one process, as being two aspects of a contradictory unity. For this reason, she failed to provide a satisfactory answer to the thorny question of, quote, who is to conduct the, quote, administration of things in the public interest, end quote, such as the economy, or how is it to be conducted, end quote. Castoriadis dedicated a large part of his endeavor to theorizing the Hungarian experience to provide a thoughtful analysis of the creation and function of the workers' councils. His approach led to significant theoretical and political implications which have wider resonance and tally with analogous observations made by Arendt. In this respect, for Castoriadis, the formation of the workers' councils and their struggle for self-management expressed the, quote, positive content, end quote, of the Hungarian Uprising. The radical activity of the Hungarian people through the form of councilist organization created, quote, new positive truths, end quote, in the sense of positing the council system as the form of social organization for an autonomous society of free and equal associated producers. Viewing the revolutionary transformation of a society as a constantly moving process and not as an apocalyptic event, placed at the core of his positions the notion that revolution is, quote, self-organization of the people, end quote, quote, explicit self-institution of society, end quote. Sorry, I just lost my spot. The radical activity of the Hungarian people through the form of councilist organization created, quote, new positive truths, end quote, in the sense of positing the council system as the form of social organization for an autonomous society of free and equal associated producers. Viewing the revolutionary transformation of a society as a constantly moving process and not as an apocalyptic event, placed at the core of his positions the notion that revolution is, quote, self-organization of the people, end quote, quote, explicit self-institution of society, end quote. Yet self-organization and self-institution are not posited in a static fashion. They are perceived as part of the conscious and always in motion procedure that amounts to the critical and practical self-education of the people. In Castoriadis' work, quote, self-organization is here self-organizing, and consciousness is becoming conscious. Both are processes, not states, end quote. Castoriadis is particularly concerned with showing the importance and deeper substance of the workers' councils. As he emphatically argued, quote, their decisive importance lies in A, the establishment of direct democracy, in other terms of true political equality, equality as to power. B, their rootedness in existing concrete collectivities which need not be only the, quote, factories, end quote. And C, their demands relative to self-management and the abolition of work norms, end quote. Castoriadis. It becomes evident from the above that in contradistinction to Arendt's severance between the political and economic function of the councils, Castoriadis viewed the councils as the building up and articulation of a social and historical experience that unmasked the mystifications of social life. The council-like organizations abolished in practice the division between classes, rulers and ruled, representatives and represented. The councilist organization overcame the separation between the political and economic spheres by seeing them as being complementary aspects of a contradictory unity that does not conceal the differences between the sections of society. In Castoriadis' view, the Workers' Council has abolished the, quote, division between a, quote, sphere of politics, end quote, or of, quote, government, and a, quote, sphere of everyday life, as essentially and antagonistically separated, end quote. Of course, councils and open assemblies as mass and autonomous forms of social organization are not a, quote, panacea, end quote, that could ensure a smooth and unproblematic radical transformation of society. However, if in this process of unfolding, radical transformation, However, if in this process of the unfolding of the revolutionary project and the self-institution of society, the issue at stake is to take the political back to society, politicize the labor social relations, and transcend the state and party forms of organization, then the council form, quote, makes this development possible, end quote. In his letter to the members of the French Communist Party Castoriadis addressed a fundamental question regarding the meaning of socialism. What is socialism? Does socialism amount to a society where a mechanism of bureaucrats administers factories and production? Or, on the contrary, does socialism imply a society in which the economy is being managed by the workers' councils, as the Hungarian workers are demanding and struggling for? The Hungarian Uprising and the forms of councilist organization were treated with contempt and disdain by the left and the orthodox Marxist parties and intellectuals. They learned nothing from the Hungarian tragedy and stood on the side of the military intervention that crushed the rebellion. Their, quote, depressing and humiliating, end quote, stance, their brutality and cynicism were another nail in the coffin of what was perceived to be the idea of socialism through the 20th century. In this climate, Castoriadis and Arendt managed to grasp the essence of the Hungarian uprising, to disclose its different temporality and reveal the potential for creating an alternative subjectivity. Thinking critically against a world of untruth, Castoriadis and Arendt were met with hostility or were systematically overlooked. As Primo Levi would assert, quote, uncomfortable truths travel with difficulty, end quote. It is not accidental that for the political theorists who are engaged with Arendt's thought, her study of the Hungarian uprising, or her references to the council system have been regarded as, quote, something of an embarrassment, end quote, and have, quote, upset most readers, end quote. In a similar vein, Castoriadis' penetrating analysis of the Hungarian uprising has been disregarded by his commentators in such a way that the radical and political implications of his views regarding the democracy of councils based upon the Hungarian experience were concealed. The Hungarian events ended up in the loss of the left's credibility and moral integrity. As a result, they aggravated the unreliability of leftist ideas and the crisis of Marxism. Castoriadis dealt insistently with the decay of Marxism, and his contribution to the debates has been significant and valuable. Section 2. Castoriadis and the Crisis of Marxism debate. The question regarding the crisis of Marxism occupied many Marxist scholars after 1898, when Masaryk spoke for the first time about the philosophical and scientific crisis of Marxism, representing the orthodox Marxism of the Second International. Masaryk sought to explore the philosophical and sociological foundations of Marxism in order to show the inadequacy of Marxist theory and policy. Paradoxically, however, Masaryk was not able to distinguish Marx from Marxism. On the contrary, in his survey, Marx was identified with Marxism, by thus criticizing what he believed to be the fundamental theoretical principles of Marxism, that is, its political tactics and sociological basis. The labor theory of value and historical materialism, he came to the conclusion that, quote, Marxism is undergoing an internal crisis not only theoretically but also in practical politics, end quote. Masaryk was familiar with the discussions that were taking place within the social democratic parties of the time, mainly in Germany and Austria. Widely known as the, quote, revisionist debate, this theoretical and political conflict is regarded as having generated the first crisis of Marxism. Quote, revisionism was expressed publicly by Edward Bernstein and could be seen as an attempt at a social democratic and, quote, right response to the question concerning the crisis of Marxism. Revisionism questioned Marxism's teleological aspects about the inevitable collapse of capitalism, the unavoidable character of the proletarian revolution, and the proletarian revolution's historical necessity. Bernstein saw parliamentary democracy and reforms as the appropriate means for achieving the socialist transformation of capitalist society. Bernstein also put particular emphasis on the continuity between the ends of socialism and the means to achieve them, rejecting any predetermined final, quote, socialist goal, end quote, and renouncing any elements of utopianism that were present in the working class movement. The, quote, left Marxist response to the question of the crisis of Marxism came from Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Korsch. In her article, Stagnation and Progress of Marxism, from 1903, Luxemburg vividly expressed her deep concern about the conditions in which Marxism found itself just 20 years after the death of Marx, and questioned its potentiality for further development and intellectual creativity. Going a little further, she acknowledged that, quote, it is undeniable that Marx has had a somewhat restrictive influence upon the free development of theory in the case of many of his pupils, end quote. Rosa Luxemburg. But who was to be blamed for this stagnation in the development of Marxist theory? For Rosa Luxemburg, Marx has provided us with more than enough theoretical tools for the practical needs of class struggle. The reason we have not made any advance upon Marx's theoretical principles lies in our inability to properly utilize Marx's intellectual legacy. On the other hand, Karl Korsch made the most substantial, quote, left Marxist contribution to this discussion. Having been deeply concerned over the atrophy of Marxist theory, he raised some intriguing questions with a view to touching upon the political and philosophical reasons for the crisis of Marxism. He questioned the relationship between Marxism and the working class movement and the role that Marxism had to play in the light of the rise of both Stalinism and fascism. Korsch also objected to the reduction of Marxist theory to some scientific, objective, quote, iron laws, end quote, and attempted to analyze the crisis of Marxism in detail. Korsch was of the opinion that the crisis had two sides, an external side, which emerged, quote, in the complete collapse of the dominant position, partially illusory but also partially real, that Marxism held during the pre-World War I era in the European working class movement, end quote. And an internal one which consisted in, quote, the transformation of Marxist theory and practice, a transformation which is most immediately apparent in Marxists' altered position vis-à-vis their own national states as well as with respect to the bourgeois system of national states as a whole, end quote. Karl Korsch. I have a bunch of essays on Karl Korsch, by Karl Korsch in on this YouTube channel. So check them out, and it's probably these quotations are probably in those recordings. More specifically, Korsch argued that after 1850, the drastic changes both in capitalism and in the labor movement, quote, prevented the further development of a living Marxist theory within the unfolding praxis of the workers' movement, end quote. Hence, throughout the second half of the 19th century, the theory was separated from the practice of the working class movement and stopped expressing the existing social relations and struggles. Rather, it reflected the class conflict as it had emerged by the year 1850. According to Korsch, both Marx and Engels based their critique and analysis of capitalism on a proletarian experience that was derived from a past historical era and had been formulated theoretically by the utopian socialists. Later on, however, they espoused and used the content of this experience for their own analyses without modifying or adapting it to the altered conditions of capitalism. Analogous endeavors to respond to the above question were made by the Frankfurt School. Quote, critical theory could be seen as an attempt to put into question the most controversial elements of orthodox Marxism. Having acknowledged that Marxism had been transformed into a closed, sterile, and fossilized ideology which played a reactionary and legitimating role for Bolshevik and social democratic policies, the Institute attempted to revitalize Marxist theory by making an effort to reconstruct some of its most problematic points. Kellner has argued that, quote, the failures of the European revolutions in the early 1920s, accompanied by the emergence of fascism, produced a, quote, crisis of Marxism, end quote, end quote. Nonetheless, critical theorists did not deal directly with the crisis of Marxism and did not proceed to examine each of these problematic dimensions in more detail or in a more radical way. As a result, for certain historical reasons, as well as from choice, they did not draw the logical conclusions, that is, the radical theoretical and political implications of the questions that they had addressed. Hence, one could say that despite their considerable theoretical contribution, they offered no theoretical and political alternative so that the crisis of Marxism could be transcended. The question concerning the crisis of Marxism remained open to further discussion after the Second World War. In this respect, the historical, political, and intellectual context during the 1950s and 1960s enabled Castoriadis to revive a discussion carried out earlier by both orthodox and critical Marxists. Castoriadis used the phrases, quote, degeneration, quote, decay, quote, petrification, quote, downfall, or, quote, corruption in order to portray the crisis of Marxism. The conclusions that Castoriadis reached in relation to the factors that led to the, quote, decay of Marxism were drawn from Marxism's historical praxis and were epitomized in his imaginary institution of society. For Castoriadis, the crisis of Marxism was due to the loss of its initial revolutionary element, as could be partially found in Marx's works. It is the revolutionary element which understands our social world as being made by human actions. Human beings themselves are responsible for their own history. They are capable of radically changing the world in and through a process of self-organization and self-emancipation that gets its own inspiration from the Paris Commune and the Soviets in the Russian Revolution. The radical aspect of Marxism grasps communism as a constant movement that negates the class-divided capitalist reality and at the same time resists the use of a completed dialectics that leads to a closed and fixed synthesis. Linked to this was the fact that Marxism took up the form of a system and was reduced to a mere ideology, a process which involved its further degeneration. According to Castoriadis, this transformation of Marxism took place on three levels. First, it served the interest of the ruling class in the Soviet-type societies and became its ideological justification and its official dogma. Second, it has also served as an ideology and as a dogmatic set of guidelines for the large number of sects and minor political groups that claim to represent authentic Marxism. And finally, Castoriadis argued, Marxism had been transformed into an ideology as it had lost its vitality and ability for further development. It is, quote, no longer even a simple theory, a living theory, end quote. By abandoning its radical and revolutionary origins, Marxism was reduced to a, quote, closed theoretical system, end quote. And this, quote, finished theory, end quote, was the final outcome of a, quote, pseudo-scientific objectivism, end quote, combined with a, quote, rationalist philosophy, end quote, that both coexisted in the thought of Marx. Posing as a complete theory, Marxism represented and continued the capitalist culture and the positivism that dominated science at the end of the 19th century. The concept of Marxism as science was overemphasized at the expense of its critical and revolutionary elements. Both nature and history were seen as being governed by rational laws independent of autonomous human actions. In Castoriadis' view, under the influence of Hegelianism, Marx's philosophy of history is a, quote, objectivist rationalism, which considered both past history and history to come as rational. Castoriadis noted that for Marx, quote, there is a reason to be found immanent in things, end quote. According to this logic, this rationality embodied in history could be studied and discovered only by those who possess the true and objective knowledge of history. This in turn implied a political perception that considered the specialists of the Leninist party, the, quote, technicians of this rationality, end quote, to be the subject of the knowledge. Critical theoretical activity was transformed into an absolute, and signified the, quote, return to the contemplative and the speculative as the dominant mode for solving the problems posed to humanity, end quote. Thus, this understanding of Marxism amounted to a separation of theory and practice and the reproduction of the dualism between subject and structure. Marxism was thus reduced to a fixed set of principles, a dogmatic doctrine that applies itself to reality from outside as the objectivity that grasps the laws of social development. In doing so, it reconstituted the dualism between thought and social practice and excluded subjectivity and radical praxis by, quote, making people comply in advance to its schemata, end quote, by submitting them to its categories, end quote. Seen from this perspective, the social reality is understood by Marxism as a given and, quote, static world, end quote. A social world that is constructed on the basis of eternal, stable relations and objective laws. As a result, politics was transformed into technique and bureaucratic manipulation, end quote. Within this logic, Marxism ceased to be a negative and destructive critique of capitalism and sought to explain the economic laws that construe the reproduction of capitalism. Historical materialism endeavored to establish causal interconnections between social and economic phenomenon, leading to a dogmatic and teleological conception of history. By extension, historical development, social change, and transition from one mode of production to another were interpreted by means of the, quote, state of technique, end quote, and its own evolution. In this line of thought, the development of the productive forces is, quote, progress, and controls the other spheres of society. For Castoriadis, Marx was enslaved by capitalist culture. For this reason, Marxism transformed human praxis into industrial practice and refused to see history as the product of human activity. Marx's stress on the development of the productive forces smoothed the way for orthodox Marxism to understand or neglect the class struggle. The self-emancipation of the working class as part of the idea of human emancipation disappeared. The, quote, laws of the development of societies, end quote, became a determinate element in the process of liberation of man. Marxism prioritized the development of the productive forces, quote, industrialization, end quote, the, quote, rationalization of production, end quote, quote, sovereignty of the economic, end quote, quote, quantification, and a, quote, plan that treats men and their activities as measurable variables, end quote. The ultimate, more extreme implication of this metamorphosis of Marxism was the emergence of Stalinism. Stalin could speak of the laws of the development of societies and used the development of the productive forces to explain the passage from one social system to another. What remains to be answered, according to Castoriadis, is, quote, how Marxists could have been Stalinists, end quote. Castoriadis preferred to reply by asking another question in order to demonstrate the relationship between Marx and Soviet Marxism. Quote, if the bosses are progressive on the condition that they build factories, how could the commissars who build just as many and even more of them not be so as well? Castoriadis argued that the closed system of Marxism constituted part of the capitalist culture and went so far as to reject not only orthodox Marxism, but all Marxism and Marx. Nonetheless, he came back to the question regarding the crisis of Marxism in 1978, when the crisis of Marxism was publicly announced by Louis Althusser and was widely discussed in Marxist academic and political circles. Section 3. Louis Althusser, quote, at last the crisis of Marxism has exploded, end quote. Althusser delivered a speech at a conference in Venice organized by the Italian political group Il Manifesto on the 13th of November 1977. His statement sparked off an intense debate. From the outset, he argued that over the previous century, the expression, quote, crisis of Marxism, had conveyed negative connotations and was employed by the political and ideological enemies of the international working class movement. Apparently, Althusser neglected the previous Marxist discussions and analyses on the same issue, as it appears paradoxical to include Luxemburg, Korsch, Trotsky, or Plechanov among the opponents of Marxism. I don't know if this is supposed to say Plekhanov or not, but it's Plechanov. Althusser drew a marked line between Marxism and the struggles of the mass movement of the people. E.g., in May 1968, and argued that it was the radical initiatives of the latter that posed difficult questions to Marxism and made the crisis a, quote, open crisis, and, quote, visible to everyone. Having acknowledged that Marxism had been through several crises in its history and had managed to survive, e.g. the, quote, bankruptcy of the Second International, Althusser stated that, quote, today Marxism is once again in crisis, end quote, and expressed the view that, quote, at last the crisis of Marxism has exploded, at last it is in full view, at last something vital and alive can be liberated by this crisis and in this crisis, end quote. It is this opportunity for the renewal of Marxist theory that enabled Althusser to undertake the challenge of elucidating the, quote, character, meaning, and implications of the crisis, end quote. Althusser's definition of the crisis of Marxism conveys a very precise meaning and, quote, concerns the difficulties, contradictions, and dilemmas in which the revolutionary organization of struggle based on the Marxist tradition are now involved, end quote. From his definition, it appears that he identified Marxism with the politics of the communist parties, and the crisis, by extension, came out first as a political crisis, a crisis of their identity that implied a drop in their membership and voters. Conversely, the fall of their constituency accelerated this crisis of identity. Altvater and Kauschuer read Althusser's theoretical effort as an agonized attempt to avert the split between party and masses that could possibly ensue from the participation of the Communist Party in the government and state apparatus, its conversion into a governing party. On a deeper level, however, what was at stake was related to the existence and survival of Communist Party politics itself. The newly emerged social movements and the autonomous radical initiatives of the people challenged the unity, practice, and strategy of the international communist movement. More importantly, they criticized or at times rejected the traditional forms of political organizations, trade unions, and political parties. Althusser unfolds his argument by associating the, quote, expression, quote, aggravation, and, quote, emergence of the crisis of Marxism with the development and tragic outcome of the Russian Revolution. The crisis was expressed as incomparability between the initial attraction of the Russian Revolution, its revolutionary promises, and the later construction of the Stalinist regime. The Soviet model ceased to constitute a radical and attractive point of reference for the anti-capitalist movement. To a considerable degree, the crisis deepened due to the fact that Marxism did not provide a reasonable and valid Marxist interpretation concerning the actual class nature of the Soviet system. On the same wavelength, Poulantzas argued that the crisis of Marxism was caused by the ongoing critique of the Western European communist parties against the Soviet regime owing to the lack of human rights and freedom of the latter. This contradiction aggravated the division of the labor movement and made it clear that we do not have a, quote, Marxist explanation, a, quote, satisfactory account of the social nature of the societies in Eastern Europe. Sweezy also came to the conclusion that, quote, the crisis of Marxian theory, end quote, could not be overcome unless we solved the enigma of so-called, quote, actually existing socialism, based upon the hypothesis that, quote, proletarian revolution can give rise to a new form of society, neither capitalist nor socialist, end quote. By seeing the crisis of Marxism through the perspective of the Russian question, Althusser sought to give some historical and theoretical depth to his analysis. As he argued, the crisis that exploded in 1977, quote, emerged in the 30s, and it was Stalin who, quote, provoked it. But at the same time, quote, he blocked it and prevented it from exploding, end quote. Humanist Marxists of Eastern Europe, mainly represented by the Czech philosopher Karol Kosik, might be Karol Kosik, the Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, and he wrote the, I don't think he stayed a Marxist, but I think he wrote the book Main Currents in the History of Marxism. Pretty sure that's what it's called. But he was a Marxist humanist. The Budapest School and the, quote, Praxis group, which I have a number of readings from those individuals from the compendium Socialist Humanism put together by Erich Fromm, I believe, in the early 1960s, in the former Yugoslavia. Also recognized that both Marxist theory and practice were in crisis. They criticized the ruling ideology of Stalinism and attempted to question some fundamental principles of orthodox Marxism. Yet in most cases, they identified the crisis of Marxism with the crisis of the Soviet-type societies. They also sought to analyze the crisis by tending to oscillate endlessly between their attempt to articulate their arguments and to avoid conflict with the regime. However, unlike these writers, Althusser took great pains not to use Stalin in the period of Stalinism as a scapegoat with a view to explaining the atrophy of Marxist theory. Without making a clear distinction between Marx and Marxism, Althusser sought the underlying causes of the crisis in the contradictions that pre-existed in Marxism. At the core of Althusser's approach lay an apparently simple proposition. Marx, Lenin, Gramsci, and Mao were, quote, only men. Men whose writings were, quote, exposed to the mistakes, to the constant need for correction, and to the errors bound up with all research, end quote. Assuming this to be the case, Althusser maintained that there is no pure theoretical tradition that has been falsified by Stalin. There is no, quote, pure heritage, end quote. Marxism is not a completed and perfect system of principles, but it contains, quote, difficulties, contradictions, and gaps, end quote. Marxism has been marked by the dominant ideology, and its own formation and development has been affected by capitalist culture. On this issue, Althusser provided 3 examples in order to pinpoint the major theoretical gaps within Marxism. The first concerned Marxist theory of exploitation, which according to Althusser's estimation amounted to a, quote, arithmetical presentation of surplus value, end quote, and thus led to a very, quote, restrictive conception of exploitation, end quote. This focus upon the quantitative aspect of exploitation resulted in disregarding the conditions of labor and exploitation. It thus reproduced the division between economic and political struggles, narrowing and weakening the class struggle as a whole. Second, and contrary to Palancis, who categorically asserted that, quote, creative Marxism has advanced satisfactorily, end quote, with regard to the issue of state theory. Althusser argued that we lack an adequate Marxist theory of the state. This weakness hinders our understanding of the Eastern European societies and prevents the communist parties in the West from unfolding a new strategy of conquest or participation in government and state power. And third, according to Althusser, Marxism has no, quote, real theory of class struggle organizations, especially of political parties and trade unions, end quote. This difficulty complicates the relationship between party and the state or the mass movement. Despite the above inadequacies, however, Althusser remained confident that the crisis of Marxism could be used in a positive and fruitful manner so as to open up new horizons and transform creatively both the theory and the practice of the working class movement. Section 4, Castoriadis versus Althusser. The views expressed by Althusser vis-à-vis the crisis of Marxism came under strong attack from Castoriadis, who replied to Althusser in an article first published in Libre in 1978. Castoriadis spoke of, quote, Althusser's crises, and argued that the French philosopher Louis Althusser was clearly reproducing the, quote, Stalinist and neo-Stalinist industry of mystification, end quote, by producing theoretically a, quote, patchwork and using a, quote, language of Caoutchouc, Cautchouc, where the final outcome was distorted because of the fact that his premises were full of elements of truth, half-truths, they're downright lies. In his article, Castoriadis pointed out that both Althusser and Eurocommunism have been identified with the dominant methods used in capitalist countries. Every position could be accepted as long as it had been inverted and transformed into an insignificant one. Althusser's method, that is, plagiarism and inversion, has had a political goal, and he is intentionally aiming to cause confusion and to weaken Marx's and Marxism's revolutionary critique without changing the substantial core of his traditional Marxism. For Castoriadis, it is obvious that Althusser, having been a, quote, ideological functionary, end quote, has never conceived Marx's revolutionary element, the profundity and boldness of his thought, as well as the radical and ruthless critique of every established authority in thought. Ultimately, Althusser's operation has had existential dimensions. He sought to preserve For Castoriadis, it is obvious that Althusser, having been a, quote, ideological functionary, has never conceived Marx's revolutionary element, the profundity and boldness of his thought, as well as the radical and ruthless critique of every... Sorry, where am I? Sorry, I had a text, important text. Sorry, I have to repeat some things. Sorry. Ultimately, Althusser's operation had existential dimensions. He sought to preserve and renew Marxism as he would be unable to exist without it. His main concern is maintain the French Communist Party's leading role and to justify his own existence. On this basis, Castoriadis attempted to evaluate Althusser's views concerning the crisis of Marxism. To unpick his patchwork, first he made an argument against Althusser's claim that Marxism had survived and was led to a renewal after the crisis and collapse of the Second International. But which Marxism had survived? In which direction had its ideology been modified? To what extent had its organizations and practices been renewed? It is clear that Althusser was referring to the, quote, It is clear that Althusser was referring to the imposition of the, quote, Leninist model on an international scale. According to Castoriadis, this simply meant a bureaucratic, totalitarian model of organization along with the admission of the Russian party's dominance over the international communist movement. This led to the Bolshevization of the communist parties and, for the first time in the history of the labor movement, the imposition of a, quote, theoretical and practical orthodoxy, end quote. Althusser very skillfully presented Marxism and the labor movement as being identical and at the same time tended to neglect the non-Marxist currents and the struggles of the radical movement. Castoriadis broaches here a theme of great interest and importance for the evolution of the anti-capitalist movement, which in a manner echoes Korsch's positions in his dealing with the defects of Lenin's critique of Bernstein's ideas. For Korsch, Lenin's attack against social democratic revisionism, despite its merit, was rooted in ideological presuppositions. At the heart of Lenin's critique lay the assumption that the revolutionary spirit of the labor movement could be reassured, quote, not in its actual economic and social class content, but expressly only in the leadership of this struggle by way of the Revolutionary Party, guided by a correct Marxist theory, end quote. In the same vein, Pannekoek noted that, quote, the very expression, quote, Revolutionary Party is a contradiction in terms. Second, when Althusser spoke of the crisis of Marxism, he obviously meant, quote, Althusser's Marxism, the Marxism of the bureaucratic Stalinist communist parties of Western Europe, which, by the way, were still considered by Althusser as, quote, revolutionary organizations of class struggle, end quote. In this sense, as Castoriadis argued, it was difficult for Althusser to realize why no Marxist explanation of the class character of the Soviet system had been provided by these parties. Castoriadis maintained that because of his being a, quote, ideological functionary of the party with all of its material and existential dimensions, Althusser was unable to give a satisfactory Marxist answer to the following questions. Who has benefited from the mystification of the Soviet regime? Which interests, actual social conditions, and positions have the lies of the communist parties and their ideologists concealed? Why has Althusser overlooked the fact that Marx's, quote, limits and contradictions, end quote, have not prevented Marxists, having been inspired by the best and most revolutionary elements of Marx, for analyzing the Soviet regime and revealing that it is an exploitative, repressive society ruled by a dominant class, the Stalinist bureaucracy, the Soviet bureaucracy. Above all, however, Althusser, by attributing to Stalin the blockage of the crisis in the 1930s, not only utilized the explanation of the, quote, personality cult in a, quote, comic manner, but made no reference to social and historical factors, e.g. class struggle, which could resolve the, quote, Russian enigma. Unsurprisingly, in Althusser's text, there is no indication of an extensive analysis of the concept of bureaucracy. In this way, for Castoriadis, it is no coincidence that the concept of class struggle or any socio-historical factors are lacking from Althusser's theorizing. For Castoriadis' point of view, Althusser did not want to see that responsibility for what occurred in Russia lies not with the gaps in Marx's theory of the state, but with the role the Bolshevik Party had played as a means of suppression of the autonomous struggle of the Russian labor movement, Soviets, workers' councils, and factory committees. Beyond Althusser's concern regarding the issues about state theory, one could see his attempt to veil the reactionary function of the bureaucratic and hierarchically organized party, which claims to possess the absolute truth. According to Castoriadis, the real problem for the, quote, science of historical materialism derives from the fact that it is not able to perceive that a ruling class could emanate from outside the, quote, production relations, end quote. That is, from a dominant ruling party. In this respect, one has to put the blame not on Marx's theoretical gaps or simply its infection by the dominant ideology, but on the, quote, positive elements of Marx's theory and their correlation with the, quote, capitalist imaginary significations, end quote. The adoration of capitalist, quote, rationalism, of technique and organization, the faith in the iron laws of history that imply the inevitability of socialism, just to mention some of them. In Castoriadis' view, all these points amount to a large part of the theory and practice of Marxism and have not only provoked its crisis, but have rendered Marxism as, quote, the most formidable obstacle that any endeavor which aims at reconstructing the revolutionary movement has to overcome, end quote. Hence, for Castoriadis, it is not surprising that Althusser wants this Marxism to be preserved as a designation fetish, while in reality is treating Marx as a dead dog. The line developed by Castoriadis, both in his analysis of the degradation of Marxist theory and the critique of Althusser's positions, addresses significant issues and has considerable political implications. Castoriadis' discussion of the crisis and decay of Marxism went in parallel with his critical endeavor to reveal contradictions and inadequacies that could be traced to Marx's theorizing. He went back to Marx not to liberate Marx from these inconsistencies, which are admittedly present in his writings, but to flee from Marx, to go beyond his theorizing. The main props of his critical endeavor derived from his intention to use his analysis of the crisis of Marxism to announce the death of Marxism, to show that Marxism is, quote, dead as theory, end quote. At times, and despite his claims to the contrary, Castoriadis followed the orthodox Marxist interpretations of Marx, reproducing the schemata of traditional Marxism, that is to say, the base superstructure metaphor along with its determinism and fatalism. Also, there is a case to be made for Castoriadis' kinship with Althusser's dealing with critical Marxism. First, Castoriadis' reading of the crisis of Marxism remained anchored in the traditional Marxist reading of Marx through the base superstructure metaphor from Marx's preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy published in 1859. Second, his analytical framework strongly resembles the uncritical presuppositions of revisionist debate or Althusser's interpretive method. Especially when Castoriadis identified Marx and Marxism, Castoriadis also intentionally neglected other critical traditions and currents of Marxism. Likewise, he overlooked the theoretical development of critical Marxism as he was more interested in announcing that Marxism has come to an end and no longer exists as a living and creative theory. But in response to his claims, one could ask, by using Brian Singer's words, quote, "Is not Castoriadis, at least until 1964, an example of Marxism's potential creativity?" End quote. Fucking amen to that. Similar to traditional Marxism, Capital was understood as a text on economics that provided an alternative, problematic, and misleading economic theory that bears great responsibility for the petrification and tragic failure of Marxism. Misjudging Marx's critical theoretical activity, Castoriadis failed to grasp Marx's dialectic method as a, quote, critical explication of economic categories, end quote, and a, quote, critique of economics, end quote, in order to destroy, quote, the categorical basis of academic economics, end quote. Castoriadis added a further dimension to his analysis of the downfall of Marxism when he maintained that Marxism's degeneration and loss of its revolutionary element reflected the, quote, fate of the revolutionary movement in capitalist society up to now, end quote. The reduction of Marxism to a simple ideology involved its integration into capitalist society. This in turn led Castoriadis to the point of extending his own fatalism by assuming the domination of capital and emphasizing the duration and stability of capitalist social relations, as Castoriadis put it. Quote, "Capitalism has been able to maintain and even to strengthen itself as a social system. We cannot conceive of a society in which, in the long run, the power of the dominant classes is affirmed, and in which, simultaneously, a revolutionary theory lives and develops. The evolution of Marxism is indissociable from the evolution of the society in which Marxism has existed," end quote. Castoriadis. In Castoriadis' understanding, as indicated in the above passage, capital is powerful and dominant. It is taken as the subject, the determining factor that subordinates and assimilates any oppositional power. The emphasis here is placed on the domination of capitalism rather than the struggle of the oppressed. Marxism, thus, is understood by Castoriadis as a theory that represents the victims of oppression, as a theory of capitalist oppression, and not as a theory of the fragility and contradictions of that oppression. Excuse me 1 second. Additionally, and despite their different perspectives, both Castoriadis and Althusser perceived Marxism as a theory of society and not as a theory of contradiction, a theory against society. In this sense, Marxism was understood as a theory aiming at providing an interpretation of the objective laws of capitalist society rather than a theory that intends the destruction of capitalist society. Marxism, then, is reduced into a theory of capitalist domination and analysis of the structures and not a theory of struggle against capitalism. As a result, Marxism is confined to the study of the function and reproduction of structures, and their, quote, crisis becomes its crisis, end quote. At times, however, Castoriadis' theoretical approach to the crisis of Marxism echoes the most radical elements of critical theory, which constitute a sharp break with the dogmatism of the Second and Third International. Castoriadis contributed well in rejecting the burdens of traditional Marxism and furnishing counterpoints for the rebirth of radical theory and praxis. From From the outset, Castoriadis underscored the fact that as soon as Marxism had been institutionalized and become a scientific Weltanschauung, which is worldview in German, its revolutionary spirit withered away. Through its reduction to a reformist and established ideology, Marxism had led to its own self-refutation and abolition. It became a closed theoretical system, a never formulated dogma. Nobody knew what Marxism really meant. Determinism, teleology, and positivism derived from this perception of Marxism as a complete and perfect system, a finished theory. This idea entailed the abandonment of negative and questioning thought and the establishment of new forms of authority. The systematization of Marxism meant Marxism's own rapid deformation and further reification. On a second level, Castoriadis contributed to the questioning of the identification of orthodox Marxism. Come on, you bitch. What the fuck? Sorry, my fucking computer's being a douchebag. 1 second. Let's try to find where I was. Where am I? Castoriadis contributed well in rejecting the burdens of traditional Marxism and furnishing counterpoints for the rebirth of radical theory and praxis. From the outset, Castoriadis underscored the fact that as soon as Marxism had been institutionalized and became a scientific Weltanschauung, its revolutionary spirit withered away. Through its reduction to a reformist and established ideology, Marxism was led to its own self-refutation and abolition. It became a closed theoretical system, a never formulated dogma. Nobody knew what Marxism really meant. Determinism, teleology, and positivism derived from this perception of Marxism as a complete and perfect system, a finished theory. This idea entailed the abandonment of negative and questioning thought and the establishment of new forms of authority. The systematization of Marxism meant its own rapid deformation and further reification. On a second level, Castoriadis contributed to the questioning of the identification of orthodox Marxism with the revolutionary movement as a mystification. He fiercely challenged the dogmatic presuppositions that take as natural and for granted the prevalent position and hegemony of Marxism within the anti-capitalist movement. This pre-established relationship between the Marxist doctrine and the radical movement should not be perceived as enduring and timeless. Yet Castoriadis failed or refused to understand that revolutionary theory and praxis need the, quote, warm streams, end quote, of critical Marxism and Marx to the same extent as they need the, quote, warm streams, end quote, of anarchism, radical feminism, ecology, autonomism, or any other tendency of the mass movement that could enrich our struggles for the revolutionary transformation of capitalism. As Clark has nicely put it, quote, whether or not Marx's name is attached to such a movement is neither here nor there. What matters is that we should take full advantage of the insights that Marx's work has to offer. Fucking end quote, amen. I need to read stuff I hate more. Castoriadis also underlined the responsibility of Leninism both as an ideology and as a political practice for the, quote, canonization, crisis, and decay of Marxism. In opposition to Marx's critical principles, the Leninist model of the party, as the only exemplary form of organization of class struggle, fetishized, sterilized, and preserved Marxism as a codified set of, quote, holy canons. Castoriadis considered that both the Bolshevik party and the ideology precipitated the several metamorphoses of Marxism. Although there was a gulf between Lenin and Leninism, between Lenin's thought and Stalinism, the degeneration of Marxism became worse during Lenin's period, when not only was Marx's work used to justify Lenin's policies and tactics, but also basic Marxian premises were entirely inverted. Beyond this, the fragmentation of the international communist movement and the various splits of the Leninist parties created different versions of traditional Marxism, which were fighting each other for the right to claim the representation of authentic and orthodox Marxism. As Castoriadis characteristically noted in a later article, quote, "Orthodoxy requires guardians of orthodoxy, that is, a church or a party machine. A church committed to orthodoxy needs an inquisition, and heretics must be burned or sent to the gulag," end quote, Castoriadis. Last but not least, Castoriadis ascribed to this Leninist metaphysics of the party one of the major causes of the tragic outcome of the Russian Revolution. Soviet Marxism and Soviet-type societies were seen by Castoriadis as determining factors in the crisis of Marxism. The success of the Russian Revolution was basically a Pyrrhic victory, since it was not the state but Marxism itself that withered away. Damn, that's fresh. Not the state but Marxism that withered away. I fuck with that. Castoriadis repeatedly reminded us of the significance that an understanding and comprehension of the character of the Soviet regime had for contemporary revolutionary struggles. In his words, the, quote, "Russian question was and remains the touchstone of the theoretical and practical attitudes that call for revolution," end quote. Evidently, a simply theoretical reflection upon Castoriadis' critique of Althusser and its contribution to the crisis of Marxism issue cannot fully reveal the new possibilities that stand before critical theory for the reunity of thought and action. It would not be possible to resolve the theoretical mysteries of this controversy in the direction of radical and anti-capitalist theory practice, based exclusively upon the battle of ideas and independently of social reality and the struggles for social emancipation. In this respect, the intensification of contemporary class struggles all over the world could shed light on the crisis of Marxism debate and underline its relevance to emancipatory politics today. The most recent movements of squares, or the Occupy movement, for instance, or the rebellions in the Arab world and social explosions or uprisings that have erupted across the continents, have challenged the culture, theory, and practice of the international anti-capitalist movement. The development of non-party forms of struggle and the multiplicity of the emerging global resistance have posed significant political and theoretical questions in respect of the content, form, organization, and efficacy of the radical movement in times of severe neoliberal crisis. They also imply a radical transformation of our mental conceptions of the world, a resignification of words and revolutionary ideas, which could lead to theoretical and practical openings, strengthening the emancipatory movement and its potential to move from revolt to self-organization and self-institution of society. Castoriadis participated in the, quote, crisis of Marxism debate and argued that both in its theoretical claims and in its historical reality, Marxism had been converted into an ideology which was used to veil and mystify concrete social relations. Having directed his critique against this ideological and reactionary function of orthodox Marxism, Castoriadis came to understand that if one wanted to elucidate the foundations and the crisis of Marxism, it was necessary to seek Marx's relationship with Marxism. Castoriadis' passage from the critique of Marxism to the critique of Marx prompted a reappreciation of fundamental critical concepts and theoretical categories and enabled Castoriadis to readdress critical issues from a radical perspective and at the same time to draw fruitful conclusions in contrast with the conventional ways of dealing with Marxist thinking. He addressed as necessary the task of exploring concrete aspects of Marx's writings as responsible for what Marxism became in both theory and practice. As a consequence, Castoriadis moved from a restricted to a more general critique of Marx. Thus, his analysis of the crisis of Marxism took the form of both a critique of Marxism and a critical confrontation with Marx's own thought.